A single measured breath can start an interstellar war, but it takes a profound, blinding arrogance to laugh at the match about to ignite your entire civilization. The Grand Hall of Hubris on the planet Vael Prime was never designed for the delicate art of diplomacy. It was an architectural monument to subjugation, a cavernous space built to dwarf anyone who dared step inside. Towering pillars of fractured basalt reached up to a vaulted ceiling bathed in the harsh crimson light of the system's twin suns. Massive banners woven from the fibrous hides of conquered beasts hung from the rafters, telling stories of 1,000 worlds brought to their knees. At the far end of the room, elevated above the groveling masses, sat Warlord Zarkon. He lounged upon a throne carved from the crystallized skeletal remains of a deep space leviathan. Zarkon was a mountain of engineered muscle and hardened chitin, his body armored in overlapping plates of iridescent black. The Vaelians were the galaxy's apex predators. They had violently clawed their way from a brutal predatory evolution into the stars, and in an unbroken millennium of galactic conquest, they had never once tasted the bitter ash of defeat. Standing perfectly still before this towering altar to violence was Ambassador Elias Thorne. He represented an almost absurd contrast to the room and everything in it. Elias wore a simple, impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit. He carried no weapons, bore no kinetic armor, and possessed no natural biological defenses. In the eyes of the gathered Vaelian royal court, he was nothing more than soft, fleshy prey, a representative of a weak fledgling species that had only recently stumbled out of their own solar system. Yet, Elias stood perfectly straight. His posture betrayed none of the paralytic terror that should have dropped a creature of his fragile stature to the stone floor. He exuded a calm, quiet dignity that felt distinctly out of place in a den of monsters. Elias cleared his throat. The sound was tiny in the vast, echoing hall, but the silence that immediately followed was absolute. The court was waiting. They wanted to hear the prey squeal before the hunt began. "Warlord Zarkon," Elias said, his voice steady, carrying clearly across the polished obsidian floors. "The United Earth Directorate has reviewed your demands for the immediate and unconditional surrender of the New Eden colony. I am here to deliver our final response." Zarkon leaned forward. The movement was slow and deliberate, resting his massive, scaled chin on a fist the size of an engine block. His eyes, burning with a predatory, bioluminescent yellow glow, fixed intently on the human. "You have no response, little flesh." Zarkon rumbled. The sound vibrated violently in the chest cavities of everyone present, a physical manifestation of raw power. "You have only compliance, or you have extinction. There is no third path for your kind." Elias did not flinch. He did not shift his weight or break eye contact with the warlord. He reached into his breast pocket slowly and pulled out a small, antiquated object of polished silver. It was an old Earth pocket watch. He checked the time, snapped the lid shut with a crisp click, and placed it back inside his suit. "We respectfully decline your offer of subjugation," Elias stated, his tone as casual as if he were declining a second cup of coffee. "Furthermore, I am authorized by the Directorate to issue a final, non-negotiable directive. We are aware that your armada is currently massing at the edge of the frontier. You will halt your advance immediately. Specifically, your fleet must under no circumstances cross the Cygnus Taurian meridian at spatial coordinate 774. Elias paused, letting the coordinates hang in the heavy air. If a single Vaelian warship breaches that specific line, humanity will consider it an act of total unrestricted war. We will not seek a treaty afterward. We will not negotiate terms. We will respond with absolute disproportionate force, and we will not stop until the threat you pose is entirely neutralized." For a long, deeply stretched second, the hall was utterly, suffocatingly silent. The alien warlord simply stared at the human ambassador, as if trying to comprehend a joke spoken in a dead language. Then, a low rumble started deep within Zarkon's massive chest. It bubbled up his throat, vibrating through the chitinous plates of his neck, and finally erupted into a booming, deafening roar of laughter. The court instantly followed his lead. Hundreds of Vaelian nobles, seasoned generals, and favored concubines threw their heavy heads back and barked, howled, and roared with genuine, unadulterated amusement. The sound was a physical wave of mockery crashing down on the solitary human standing in the center of the room. They were laughing at the sheer, unbridled absurdity of the situation. A species that barely controlled a fraction of the Orion Arm, whose military vessels were rumored to be retrofitted cargo haulers, was standing in the throne room of the galaxy's supreme conquerors, threatening them with disproportionate force. It was the funniest thing Zarkon had heard in a century. Amidst the roaring, tear-inducing laughter, the dark political machinery of the Vaelian court was already grinding its gears. To the immediate left of the Leviathan throne, General Kalen, a heavily scarred veteran of the brutal Centauri campaigns, exchanged a sly, calculating glance with his rival, General Vorak. To the military elite, the upcoming extermination of the human worlds was no longer a serious military exercise. It was merely a political stepping stone. Vorak sneered, his mandibles clicking rapidly in anticipation. He was already formulating a plan to position his vanguard fleet at the very front of the formation to claim the richest spoils of New Eden. Capturing the human agricultural centers and their rumored atmospheric processors would secure his immense wealth and solidify his place as Zarkon's highly favored successor. Kalen, meanwhile, was calculating the exact opposite strategy. He planned to let Vorak's forces take the initial, albeit pathetic, human defensive fire, hoping the minor skirmishes would deplete Vorak's fuel and munitions just enough to leave him vulnerable to a sudden, tragic friendly fire incident later in the campaign. The humans were entirely an afterthought to these towering generals. They were mere insects, a temporary nuisance to be crushed underfoot while the real predators fought over control of the hive. The laughter eventually subsided into harsh chuckles and wide, predatory grins. Zarkon wiped a tear of mirth from his glowing yellow eye and waved a dismissive, heavy hand at the ambassador. "Take the meat back to its transport ship," the warlord commanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let him return to his directorate. Let him watch the destruction of his precious colony from the safety of the deep void. I want him to witness what absolute force truly looks like before we come for his homeworld." Two heavily armored Vaelian royal guards stepped forward from the shadows, their energy pikes humming with lethal voltage, and flanked Elias. The ambassador did not resist. He bowed his head slightly. It was not a gesture of submission, nor was it a sign of defeat. It was something far stranger, something that unsettled the air around him. Elias turned on his heel and began the long walk down the vast, red-carpeted aisle toward the massive, reinforced blast doors. His footsteps were light, perfectly paced, completely ignoring the heavy, thudding boots of his giant escorts. From the dark, recessed shadows of a nearby pillar, Chief Intelligence Officer Xylar watched the human depart. Xylar was physiologically different from the generals who relied on brute force. He belonged to a subjugated species that had been integrated into the Empire specifically for their hyper-perceptive neural pathways. He did not traffic in plasma cannons or fleet formations. He dealt entirely in the currency of secrets, behavioral analysis, and neurochemical observation. Xylar's 4 compound eyes tracked the human's every micro-expression, every subtle shift in his gait. As he watched Elias walk away, the intelligence officer felt a sudden, icy shiver run down his spinal ridge. The human was not projecting fear. As an empath-adjacent species, Xylar could literally read the biological markers of those around him. There was no elevated heart rate in the human's chest. There was no scent of panic pheromones leaking from his pores. There were no trembling hands or rapid eye movements. Prey always felt fear when surrounded by predators. It was the fundamental law of the universe. But Elias Thorne was projecting something else entirely. The human was projecting a deep, profound grief. Xylar analyzed the data flooding his senses, his mind racing. Elias Thorne looked exactly like a man walking away from a graveyard, mourning the inevitable death of something he could not save. The realization struck Xylar with the force of a physical blow. Apex predators understood fear perfectly, but grief implied something horrifying. Grief implied that the prey knew the predator was already dead. Xylar watched the heavy blast doors slam shut behind the tiny human, sealing the throne room. A terrifying question began to echo relentlessly in the intelligence officer's mind, drowning out the lingering chuckles of the royal court. What had the weak human known that the undisputed masters of the galaxy did not? What exactly was waiting for the invincible Vaelian armada at coordinate 774? A fleet that possesses the raw tonnage to eclipse a sun does not travel through the void. It bludgeons the fabric of reality completely out of its way. The Vaelian armada was a localized gravitational event, a terrifying swarm of jagged obsidian dreadnoughts tearing a burning path toward the human colony of New Eden. From the observation deck of his flagship, the Worldbreaker, Warlord Zarkon watched the swirling, violent colors of the slipspace tunnel reflecting off his dark armor. His armada was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. 3,000 capital ships flanked by tens of thousands of strike cruisers and planetary siege platforms flew in a tight, aggressive formation. The sheer scale of the military mobilization was enough to shatter the morale of most star systems before a single plasma battery was ever charged. Yet, even in the midst of this glorious projection of absolute power, the petty squabbles of his underlings raged on. On the tactical holotable behind Zarkon, the energy signatures of his two leading generals engaged in a silent, lethal dance of one-upmanship. General Vorak had ordered his vanguard squadron to run their dark matter engines well beyond recommended safety thresholds, burning through immense fuel reserves simply to maintain a few thousand kilometers of lead over General Kalen's flanking fleet. Kalen, in retaliation, was subtly adjusting his fleet's trajectory, purposefully riding the turbulent energetic wake generated by Vorak's ships, causing microfractures in the Vanguard's aft shielding. It was a reckless, arrogant display of internal politics, a dangerous game of intimidation played out in the deadly vacuum of deep space. Zarkon allowed it. The friction kept their predatory instincts sharp. They were racing toward a slaughter, and the prize was the plunder of a fertile, unsuspecting human world. Bored with the holographic posturing of his generals, Zarkon turned his massive frame away from the viewport. He descended deep into the heavily armored labyrinthine bowels of the flagship, moving past ranks of saluting shock troopers until he reached the high-value containment sector. The air down here was cold, sterile, and thick with the hum of localized energy fields. Inside the maximum security cell sat Dr. Elena Rostova. She was a human planetary engineer, captured during a bloody border skirmish 6 months prior when a Vaelian raiding party had overwhelmed her geological survey team. She wore the drab, gray synthetic uniform of a political prisoner, and under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights, the bruising along her cheekbones and jawline was vividly apparent. Despite months of brutal interrogations and psychological pressure, her posture remained intensely rigid. She did not cower in the corner. She sat squarely in the center of the metallic bench, her sharp, calculating eyes tracking the Warlord as he entered her cell. "Your little diplomat came to my grand hall today," Zarkon rumbled, his voice filling the cramped space, intentionally trying to dominate her senses. He stood before my throne and begged for the survival of your colony. A microscopic tremor ran through Elena's hands, though she instantly masked it by clasping them tightly in her lap. Elias. The mere mention of his name flooded her mind with memories she had locked away to survive her captivity. She remembered the scent of rain on the terraforming rigs of Mars, the quiet, stolen hours they had spent charting frontier star maps in his cramped quarters, and the deep, unspoken vow they had made to protect the fragile colonies they were helping to build. The Vaelian Warlord thought he was taunting her, but he had just given her the greatest gift imaginable, proof that Elias was alive, and proof that the United Earth Directorate knew exactly where the Vaelian fleet was heading. Elena offered Zarkon a tight, humorless smile. Elias Thorne does not beg, Warlord. He assesses, he categorizes. He likely only visited your throne room to officially file your entire species under the category of terminal stupidity. Zarkon sneered, stepping closer, his massive shadow completely engulfing her. He issued a warning. He told me there was a line in the void that my armada must not cross, or humanity would unleash absolute destruction upon us. It was the most pathetic display of posturing I have witnessed in my entire reign. I laughed at him. Doctor, my entire court laughed at him. And now, my ships are going to burn New Eden to the bedrock. Elena let out a dry, rasping laugh. It was a dark, wry sound that seemed to confuse the towering alien. You brought 3,000 capital ships to exterminate a farming colony. Zarkon, for the supreme apex predator of the galaxy, you suffer from a truly staggering insecurity complex. Are you terrified of our automated wheat harvesters? Zarkon slammed a heavy fist against the bulkhead, denting the solid polyalloy. I brought 3,000 ships to demonstrate what inevitability looks like. Your species is soft. You have no natural armor, no redundant organs, no biological weapons. You are prey masquerading as a spacefaring civilization. Elena leaned forward, entirely unfazed by the display of physical violence. Her eyes locked onto the Warlord's glowing yellow irises. You fundamentally misunderstand how humans evolved. Zarkon, we were the softest things on our planet. When a saber-toothed predator entered our caves, we didn't try to wrestle it. We didn't try to grow thicker skin. We stepped back. We dug a pit. We lined the bottom with poisoned stakes, and we covered it with leaves. We survived by building traps for things much larger and much stupider than we were. She tilted her head, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Elias didn't come to your planet to negotiate with you. He came to verify that your ego was large enough to fly exactly where he needed you to go. Before Zarkon could formulate a response to her insolence, a sharp, rhythmic tone chimed from the communication relay on his wrist armor. The voice of his chief navigator filtered through the speaker, crisp and urgent. Warlord, we are approaching the Cygnus Taurian meridian. We are 30 seconds away from spatial coordinate 774. General Vorak is requesting permission to ignite secondary afterburners to cross the threshold ahead of the main formation. Zarkon stared at Elena. She did not break eye contact. There was no fear in her expression, only a chilling, absolute certainty. The Warlord felt a fleeting, irrational spike of hesitation. A tiny voice in the back of his mind questioning the human ambassador's bizarrely specific warning. But he quickly crushed the feeling under the immense weight of his own pride. To halt the fleet now, to show caution because of a captive human's riddle, would be political suicide. Vorak and Kalen would smell weakness instantly. Granted, Zarkon barked into his communicator. Tell Vorak to push his engines to maximum. The Vanguard crosses first. Let the humans watch us shatter their imaginary line. On the bridge of the flagship, the tactical displays flashed with rapid updates. The massive Vaelian armada surged forward, an unstoppable tidal wave of armor and plasma tearing through the cosmic void. At the very tip of the spear, General Vorak's heavily armed dreadnought smashed through the exact spatial coordinates Elias Thorne had specified. There was no blinding flash of light. There was no sudden ambush by hidden human warships. There were no proximity mines, no kinetic barriers, no spatial anomalies to halt their advance. The vast, empty vacuum of space remained entirely unchanged. General Vorak's mandibles clicked in triumph as his navigation officers confirmed they had successfully breached the coordinate. The human threat had been utterly hollow, a desperate bluff from a dying species. The Vaelian fleet continued its relentless march toward New Eden, the crews emboldened by their own invincibility. But deep within the invisible fabric of the sector, something shifted. When Vorak's massive dreadnought crossed the meridian, its immense gravitational displacement brushed against a microscopic, dormant network of quantum transmitters scattered across the star system like dust. The crossing did not trigger a bomb, it triggered an algorithm. A silent, instantaneous packet of heavily encrypted telemetry data snapped across the void, bouncing through subspace relays faster than light, completely undetected by the sophisticated Vaelian sensors. The trap had been expertly laid, the leaves had been meticulously arranged, and the apex predators of the galaxy had just eagerly marched right over the edge of the pit. A true master of warfare does not attack the enemy's heavy armor. They quietly dismantle the enemy's perception of reality. The Vaelian armada tore through the Cygnus Taurian meridian, their dark matter engines burning with the fury of 1,000 captured stars, ready to unleash apocalyptic violence upon the human defenders. General Vorak stood on the command deck of his vanguard dreadnought, his mandibles spread wide in a terrifying grin of anticipation. His tactical officers were scanning the deep void, hungry for the first sign of the pathetic human fleet. They expected a desperate blockade of retrofitted cargo haulers and fragile orbital defense platforms. Instead, they found absolute terrifying silence. Then, without any warning from the long-range sensors, the forward navigational arrays began to bleed anomalous data. It started as a subtle drift in the celestial telemetry. The targeting computers aboard Vorak's dreadnoughts suddenly registered microscopic variations in the gravitational pull of the surrounding star systems. The stars themselves seemed to be shifting slightly out of alignment on the digital displays. The Vaelian navigators, trained to operate with brutal mathematical precision, frantically attempted to recalibrate their instruments, assuming a localized magnetic anomaly was distorting their optics. But the harder they tried to correct the course, the wildly more erratic the data became. Suddenly, a massive cluster of thermal signatures bloomed on the tactical holotable right in the direct path of the vanguard. Enemy fleet detected. A tactical officer barked, his voice tight with sudden adrenaline. Multiple capital-class vessels flanked by hundreds of strike cruisers. They are holding position in the dust nebula directly ahead. Vorak lunged forward, his yellow eyes narrowing at the optical feed. Through the swirling cosmic dust, the unmistakable silhouettes of human warships materialized. They were brutal, ugly things compared to the sleek Vaelian dreadnoughts blocky, utilitarian vessels bristling with primitive kinetic railguns and heavy missile pods. They were perfectly positioned in a defensive phalanx, a desperate last stand to protect the colony world behind them. The Vaelian general did not hesitate. The trap was sprung, but he was the apex predator, and he would simply smash through it. "Lock all forward batteries," Vorak roared, the command echoing across the massive bridge. "Divert auxiliary power to the plasma lances. I want that blockade turned into molten slag before they can even charge their pathetic shields." Fire. The Vanguard fleet unleashed a synchronized barrage of staggering destructive power. Millions of credits worth of high-yield plasma torpedoes and concentrated energy beams tore across the void, illuminating the dark nebula in a blinding, apocalyptic flash of localized sunfire. The sheer volume of the Vaelian volley was enough to crack a small moon in half. Vorak watched the optical feed with vicious satisfaction, waiting for the spectacular detonations of the human ships. The plasma lances struck the human dreadnought's dead center, and then they passed right through them. There were no explosions. There was no shattering of armor or venting of atmosphere. The devastating Vaelian munitions simply sailed effortlessly through the metallic hulls of the human blockade, continuing harmlessly into the deep void until they eventually fizzled out against the cosmic background radiation. On the optical feed, the blocky human warships flickered like a degraded transmission, dissolved into a cloud of static, and vanished completely. A profound, suffocating silence fell over Vorak's bridge. The tactical officers stared at their consoles in blank, uncomprehending horror. The mass shadows had registered on their gravitational sensors. The thermal bloom had been perfect. Yet, they had just emptied 15% of their forward munitions reserves, firing at empty space. On the flagship Worldbreaker, Warlord Zarkon watched the disastrous engagement unfold on his own holotable. Before he could issue a reprimand, the harsh, mocking laughter of General Kalen flooded the secure command channel. A brilliant display of overwhelming force. "Vorak," Kalen sneered, his voice dripping with venomous delight. "You have successfully annihilated a cloud of cosmic dust. Please, let my flanking fleet know if any rogue comets attempt to challenge your supremacy next." Vorak snarled a string of vicious Vaelian curses into the comms, his humiliation absolute. He demanded a full diagnostic of the sensor arrays, completely blind to the terrifying reality of the situation. The humans had not simply deployed holographic decoys. Standard holograms did not cast gravitational shadows. The humans were projecting localized space-time mirages, bending the foundational laws of physics to create phantoms that fooled the most advanced predatory sensors in the galaxy. While the Vaelian armada chased ghosts in the deep void, a far more insidious devastation was quietly taking root light years away. Back on the homeworld of Vael Prime, the undisputed center of the galactic empire, the sky was a perfect bruised crimson. High Minister Vex, a bloated, arrogant bureaucrat draped in the heavy silks of the ruling class, was presiding over a planetary council meeting in the highest spire of the capital city. He was delivering a remarkably dull speech regarding the economic redistribution of the human agricultural assets once Vorak burned their world to ash. Mid-sentence, the grand, luminous chandeliers of the council chamber flickered violently. The low, omnipresent hum of the anti-gravity generators beneath the floorboards stuttered, causing a momentary, nauseating drop in the room's artificial gravity. Several of the elderly council members gasped, clutching their gilded armrests. Vex merely waved a dismissive, heavy hand, his face twisting in annoyance. "A minor fluctuation in the grid," he announced loudly, projecting absolute confidence. "The upper atmosphere is likely experiencing an ion storm from the twin suns. Our planetary shielding will adjust. The weather is of no concern to the architects of the Empire." The council murmured their agreement, easily pacified by the arrogance they all shared. They were the masters of the universe. A flickering light bulb was beneath their notice, but hundreds of miles below the pristine surface of the capital, deep within the heavily fortified planetary engineering catacombs, the atmosphere was entirely different. Panic was a contagion spreading rapidly among the master technicians. Chief Engineer Rax frantically ran his 4 hands over a massive, glowing diagnostic console. The planetary grid was not suffering from a weather anomaly. The data cascading down his screens was impossible, a direct contradiction to everything he understood about thermodynamics. When the Vaelian armada crossed the spatial coordinate at the Cygnus Taurian meridian, they had unwittingly triggered a microscopic, heavily encrypted data packet. This packet did not attack the fleet's physical armor. It rode the fleet's instantaneous quantum communication handshake straight back to the homeworld. The humans had not sent a bomb. They had sent a localized entropy virus. Rax watched in sheer, unadulterated terror as the atomic decay rates within the capital's primary fusion cores began to wildly fluctuate. The virus was not shutting the power down. It was unweaving the mathematical stability of the systems. Cooling units began to generate heat. Magnetic containment fields inverted their polarity for fractions of a second. The very code that governed the automated infrastructure of the entire planet was slowly, methodically being rewritten into chaos. The profound, devastating moral lesson of the universe was unfolding in real time beneath the arrogant feet of the Vaelian politicians. The Vaelians had spent a millennium building kinetic armor strong enough to withstand supernovas, and arming ships capable of cracking planets. But in their supreme, unquestioned confidence, they had left their digital and quantum architecture completely exposed. They never once imagined that a soft, frail, lesser species could understand the foundational mathematics of reality, let alone weaponize it. The strong spend their lives building impenetrable walls to protect their thrones. The smart quietly alter the foundation beneath the castle. Rax slammed his fist against the emergency containment alarm, but the siren only produced a pathetic, garbled hiss. The entropy was accelerating. The automated distress signals to the fleet were twisting into nonsensical static before they even left the atmosphere. The most powerful empire in history was being dismantled from the inside out, and the architects of that empire still thought it was just raining. The terrifying question remained unanswered as Rax watched the containment pressure drop toward critical levels. If the human fleet that Vorak had engaged was nothing more than a space-time mirage designed to waste Vaelian time and ammunition, where was the actual human armada waiting to strike? And far more pressing for the inhabitants of Vael Prime when the entropy virus finally breached the planetary core, what would be left of the invincible empire but a memory of its own hubris? The most terrifying discovery for an apex predator is not a larger set of fangs waiting in the brush, but an entirely empty clearing where the prey was supposed to be cornered. The Vaelian armada violently tore its way back into real space, a massive, jagged scar of dark metal against the cosmic tapestry. 3,000 capital ships and tens of thousands of strike cruisers dropped out of the slipspace tunnel in perfect, aggressive synchronization. They surrounded the lush blue-green marble of New Eden like a swarm of locusts blotting out the sun. Weapons batteries were fully charged. Targeting algorithms were locked. The crews were practically salivating at their stations, ready to unleash a planetary bombardment that would turn the human colony into a molten, uninhabitable husk within hours. General Vorak stood triumphantly on his bridge, eager to claim the first kill. He barked the order to initiate a full-spectrum biological and thermal scan of the planet's surface, preparing to target the densely populated agricultural centers and civilian hubs. He waited for the tactical holotable to light up with billions of terrified heat signatures. The holotable remained a flat, featureless blue. Vorak scowled, striking the console with a heavy fist, assuming his sensor technicians had failed to recalibrate the arrays after the slipspace jump. He demanded a manual sweep, threatening his officers with immediate execution if they did not produce targets. The technicians frantically worked their consoles, their 4 hands flying across the smooth glass interfaces, routing auxiliary power to the orbital scanners. They swept the northern continents, the equatorial archipelagos, and the vast temperate southern landmasses. "Report," Vorak demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating growl. The chief tactical officer slowly turned to face his general, his mandibles twitching in profound confusion. "General, the scans are verified. There are no biological signatures on the surface. There are no active power grids. There are no orbital defense platforms. The atmospheric processors are completely deactivated. The officer swallowed hard, the silence on the bridge growing heavier by the second. The planet is entirely abandoned. General, they are gone. On the flagship Worldbreaker, Warlord Zarkon received the same telemetry data. He stared at the holographic projection of New Eden floating gracefully above his command table. The pristine, untouched surface mocked him. The human colony was a ghost world. Every civilian, every piece of heavy machinery, every defensive asset had been meticulously evacuated long before the Vaelian armada even broke orbit from their homeworld. The massive thermal footprints they had tracked from deep space were nothing more than automated. Subterranean fusion engines left behind on a delayed timer, generating a false heat signature designed to look like a bustling, terrified metropolis from light years away. The entire planet of New Eden was a spectacularly expensive piece of bait. Panic, a raw, acidic emotion entirely foreign to the Vaelian military elite, began to rapidly spread through the high command. The secure communication channels erupted into a cacophony of accusations and sudden, terrifying realization. General Kalen, his earlier arrogance entirely evaporated, demanded to know where the human fleet was hiding. If they had abandoned their colony, they had to be massing somewhere in the frontier space for a counterattack. But the long-range sensors showed nothing but empty vacuum for parsecs in every direction. The Vaelian armada, the single most destructive concentration of military power in the known galaxy, was sitting idle over a deserted rock, completely isolated from their supply lines, having wasted immense fuel reserves to arrive at a battlefield where the enemy simply refused to show up. Before Zarkon could silence his bickering generals and issue an order to scour the neighboring star systems, the primary communications relay on the Worldbreaker shrieked with a violently distorted priority hail. The sudden influx of corrupted data was so massive it temporarily crashed the flagship's secondary tactical displays. The communication officer, his hands trembling slightly, routed the transmission to the central holotable. Warlord, it is an emergency tight beam transmission. It is coming directly from Vael Prime. Zarkon stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing on the metal deck. Put it through. The holographic projector sputtered, fighting through layers of heavy quantum interference. The image that materialized was not a crisp, military-grade transmission, but a heavily degraded, chaotic visual feed. It was High Minister Vex. The bloated bureaucrat was no longer draped in his elegant silks. His clothing was torn, and his face was contorted in a mask of absolute, unadulterated terror. The pristine, polished walls of the planetary council chamber behind him were cracked, and the artificial gravity seemed to be failing, causing debris to float lazily through the background. "Warlord!" Vex screamed, his voice breaking into a panicked, high-pitched squeal that cut through the audio static. "The grid is collapsing. The automated defenses are offline. We are blind. Zarkon, you must bring the fleet back." The sky. A massive burst of static swallowed his words, the image freezing into a distorted mosaic of pixels before rapidly re-establishing itself. Vex was no longer looking at the camera. He was staring out the massive crystalline windows of the high spire, looking up at the heavens. Zarkon ordered the communication officer to enhance the visual feed and shift the perspective to match the High Minister's line of sight. The holographic projection shifted, displaying the sky over the capital city of Vael Prime. It was midday in the Empire's capital, a time when the twin crimson suns should have been bathing the spires in warm, radiant light. Instead, the sky was a sickly, bruised twilight, but it was not the dimming light that froze the blood in Zarkon's veins. It was the stars. Through the atmospheric distortion, the brilliant, multicolored tapestry of the galactic core was clearly visible. But as Zarkon watched, the stars were rapidly winking out. They were not being covered by clouds or obscured by orbital debris. They were simply ceasing to exist in the visual spectrum, swallowed by an encroaching, unnatural sphere of absolute darkness that was steadily expanding across the heavens. It looked as though a massive, invisible predator was taking colossal bites out of the galaxy, leaving nothing but an empty, suffocating void in its wake. The darkness was not just a lack of light. It possessed a visual weight, a terrifying distortion that bent the remaining starlight around its edges like a funhouse mirror. "They are not here," Zarkon whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a kinetic strike. The phantom ships at the coordinate line, the meticulously abandoned colony world, the sudden, impossible collapse of the planetary grid back home. The pieces violently slammed into place in the Warlord's mind. Elias Thorne's warning in the Grand Hall had never been a desperate plea to protect New Eden. It had been a calculated test to see if the Vaelians were arrogant enough to commit their entire defensive force to an offensive strike at the absolute edge of human space. The human fleet had never massed for a defense. They had bypassed the frontier entirely, while the Vaelian armada had spent weeks burning through conventional slipspace lanes to reach a decoy. The humans had utilized a deeply experimental, highly classified slipspace technology to fold space-time itself. They had jumped a massive strike force directly into the undefended heart of the Vaelian Empire. The encroaching darkness swallowing the sky over Vael Prime was not a natural phenomenon. It was the gravitational shadow of an immense, localized weapon charging its primary capacitors right in the planet's upper orbit. Zarkon looked at the terrifying, silent feed of his dying sky, the mocking laughter of his royal court echoing painfully in his memory. The humans had not sent an army to fight a war. They had sent an executioner to a completely undefended throne. There is a distinct, agonizing difference between being conquered and being erased. Conquest implies a bloody struggle of equals, while erasure requires only the cold, mechanical application of an equation. On the command deck of the flagship Worldbreaker, Warlord Zarkon watched the holographic projection of his homeworld sky, paralyzed by an unfamiliar icy dread. The encroaching darkness visible through High Minister Vex's corrupted transmission was not a localized storm, nor was it a conventional orbital blockade. It was the visual manifestation of physics buckling under immense, artificial stress. The humans had not sent an invasion force to fight the Vaelian Planetary Guard. They had bypassed the military entirely to strike directly at the foundation of the Empire. High above the pristine atmosphere of Vael Prime, the United Earth Directorate had positioned a single massive super dreadnought, escorted by a silent, perfectly synchronized formation of support frigates. The human vessels were not firing plasma lances or dropping kinetic bombardments. They hung in the void like cold, metallic monoliths, operating with a terrifying, industrial efficiency. They were not there to engage in a glorious battle of attrition. They were there to perform a planetary demolition. The central human dreadnought deployed its primary payload, an experimental, localized gravitational shear field generator. It did not create a fiery, blinding explosion. It did not unleash a shockwave of thermal radiation that the Vaelian planetary shields could deflect. Instead, it projected an invisible, perfectly calculated wave of gravitational distortion deep into the planet's tectonic mantle. The weapon was designed to find the specific resonant frequency of Vael Prime's hyperdense core and amplify it until the structural integrity of the entire world simply gave way. On the holographic feed, Zarkon watched the immediate devastating effects of the human mathematics. High Minister Vex stopped screaming. The audio feed cut out completely as the planetary communication grid suffered a total, catastrophic failure. In utter, suffocating silence, the greatest city in the galaxy began to die. The grand obsidian spires of the Vaelian capital, built to withstand centuries of orbital bombardment and brutal siege warfare, were completely defenseless against an attack from beneath their own foundations. The artificial gravity generators failed instantly. Then, the crust of the planet violently sheared. A massive, jagged fissure tore directly through the center of the Grand Hall of Hubris, swallowing the Leviathan throne into the boiling, hyper-pressurized mantle below. The destruction was horrifyingly methodical. There were no desperate dogfights in the upper atmosphere. There were no heroic last stands by the elite Vaelian Royal Guard. There was only the grinding, unrelenting force of a planet tearing itself apart. The towering monuments to a millennium of galactic conquest snapped like fragile glass, their shattered remains collapsing into massive sinkholes that opened up across the continents. The oceans boiled furiously as magma breached the seabed, sending superheated steam high into the darkening atmosphere to mix with the pulverized rock. Within a matter of hours, the vibrant, fortified jewel of the Vaelian Empire was reduced to a choking global storm of gray ash and fractured tectonic plates. Zarkon stood rigidly before the holotable, the harsh blue light painting his hardened, chitinous face as he watched the silent apocalypse unfold. The holographic feed flickered one final time before the last orbital relay satellite was dragged out of the sky by the shifting gravitational forces, leaving nothing but a flat wall of gray static. The Warlord's mind replayed the sound of laughter. He heard the booming, arrogant roars of his generals and the sycophantic chuckles of his courtiers as they mocked Elias Thorne. They had laughed at the human's warning, completely blind to the fact that the soft, frail creature standing before them was casually holding the detonator to their entire civilization. The human ambassador had not been projecting grief for a dying colony. Chief Intelligence Officer Xylar had been entirely correct. Elias had been mourning the Vaelian homeworld before he even delivered the ultimatum. The humans had not struck out of malice or a bloodthirsty desire for vengeance. That was the most terrifying realization of all for an apex predator. The attack lacked any predatory passion. It was an extermination protocol executed with the detached, sterile efficiency of a surgeon cutting out a terminal tumor. The humans had calculated the exact amount of force required to permanently neutralize the Vaelian threat, and they had applied it without hesitation, without mercy, and without a single word of gloating. They had simply erased the masters of the galaxy from the board. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the bridge of the flagship. The tactical officers, the seasoned veterans of 100 brutal campaigns, stared at the static on the main display, their mandibles trembling in shock. They were warriors bred for conquest, raised on the absolute certainty of their own supremacy. But they were entirely unequipped to process the sudden, absolute annihilation of their home, their families, and their history. Zarkon felt a sickening shift in the atmosphere of his command deck. The absolute loyalty of his crew, once guaranteed by the overwhelming power of the Empire and the fear of his personal wrath, was dissolving into the same ash that now choked Vael Prime. They were no longer the vanguard of an invincible armada. They were a fleet of orphans, stranded light years from home, burning their dwindling fuel reserves over a ghost world that had been designed entirely to waste their time. The chain of command in the Vaelian military was a highly fragile construct, held together strictly by the promise of glory and the vast wealth of the homeworld. With the Empire gone, the promise of glory was dead, and as Zarkon slowly looked around the massive bridge, meeting the wide, terrified, and increasingly desperate eyes of his highest-ranking officers, he realized his personal wrath was no longer the most terrifying thing in the universe. The quiet, soft-spoken humans had definitively claimed that title. A new, highly volatile element was introduced to the tactical reality of the Vaelian armada. Without the homeworld, there were no supply lines. There were no shipyards for repairs, no munitions factories to restock their magazines, and absolutely no agricultural worlds to feed the hundreds of millions of soldiers stationed across the 3,000 capital ships. They possessed a finite amount of resources, and the humans had just proven they could bend space and gravity to crush a planet in an afternoon. The question burning in the minds of every general in the fleet was no longer how the Vaelians would conquer the galaxy. The question was how long they would survive the month. Deep within the secure detention block of the World Breaker Doctor, Elena Rostova felt the massive flagship shudder as its dark matter engines abruptly idled. The harsh fluorescent lights in her cell flickered, a subtle but distinct indication of the chaos rapidly unfolding on the command decks above. She did not know exactly what Elias and the Earth Directorate had done, but the sudden, frantic energy vibrating through the ship's hull told her the trap had successfully snapped shut. The invincible Vaelian armada had been outmaneuvered. Elena slowly stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her drab prison uniform. Her sharp mind was already calculating the shifting variables of her captivity. The humans had played their masterstroke, but her personal danger was only just beginning. When apex predators are wounded, stripped of their territory, and backed into a corner, they do not surrender gracefully. They turn feral. They violently lash out at everything around them, including each other. The Vaelian fleet was about to tear itself apart from the inside, and she was locked directly in the center of the impending slaughter. An empire does not die when its capital falls. It dies the moment its generals realize the throne is empty and the larder is bare. For the invincible Vaelian armada, the transition from galactic conquerors to desperate scavengers took exactly 4 minutes. The flat gray static of the dead Homeworld was still broadcasting on the main tactical holotable when the paralysis of shock finally wore off. On the bridge of the flagship, Warlord Zarkon turned his massive frame to issue a command to establish a fleet-wide rationing protocol, but the words died in his throat. The atmosphere in the room had fundamentally shifted. The absolute conditioned reverence his bridge crew had always held for him had evaporated entirely, replaced by the feral, wide-eyed calculation of cornered animals. Without Vael Prime, there was no centralized authority. There was no staggering wealth to distribute, no reinforcements to call upon, and critically, there was no agricultural supply line. They were 3,000 heavily armed ships sitting in a dead system, and they were all going to starve in the dark. The first volley of treason did not come accompanied by an impassioned speech or a formal declaration of mutiny. It arrived as a blinding barrage of heavy plasma torpedoes striking the starboard shields of the Worldbreaker. General Vorak and General Kalen, bitter rivals who had spent the last stellar cycle plotting each other's downfall in the Grand Court, arrived at the exact same brutal conclusion simultaneously. The flagship held the largest reserves of dark matter fuel, munitions, and raw synthetic protein in the entire fleet. In a universe where they were suddenly an endangered species, Zarkon was no longer their divine, untouchable ruler. He was merely the largest supply depot standing in their way. The void above the abandoned world of New Eden instantly ignited into a chaotic, fratricidal slaughter. The sleek, obsidian dreadnoughts that had flown in perfect, terrifying formation just an hour prior began tearing into each other at point-blank range. Plasma lances carved through heavy kinetic armor, venting atmosphere and screaming crew members into the cold, uncaring vacuum. Vorak's vanguard ships ruthlessly pinned the flagship down with concentrated fire, while Kalen's flanking cruisers moved in to systematically cripple its primary maneuvering thrusters. The apex predators were cannibalizing themselves, entirely consumed by the singular, overwhelming biological imperative to survive the coming famine. Inside the Worldbreaker, the situation was a localized nightmare. The massive ship violently shuddered as structural integrity alarms blared through the labyrinthine corridors, bathing the metal bulkheads in rotating crimson light. Zarkon realized the battle for his throne was lost before he even unholstered his heavy plasma sidearm. He was vastly outgunned by his own armada. and the elite shock troopers stationed on his vessel were already fracturing into warring factions, fighting bloody skirmishes in the lower decks over control of the food synthesizers. To stay and fight for his ship was to die a meaningless death in a dark, suffocating hallway. He needed to abandon the flagship immediately, but stepping out into a galaxy ruled by humans as a deposed, solitary alien warlord was an automatic death sentence. He needed leverage. He needed a shield, flanked by a quartet of his most fanatic, heavily armored royal guards. Zarkon fought his way down through the burning, chaotic decks. They moved with brutal efficiency, stepping over the mangled bodies of mutinous crewmen, driven by singular, desperate purpose. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and burning synthetic circuitry as they descended toward the maximum security detention block. The artificial gravity generators began to randomly stutter, the result of Kalen's targeted strikes on the engineering bays, making the brutal descent feel like a terrifying plunge into madness. Zarkon shattered the locking mechanism of the high-value containment sector with a massive kinetic punch. He stepped into the holding area, his massive chest heaving, his iridescent black armor scorched and smeared with the glowing blue blood of his own species. Doctor. Elena Rostova was sitting exactly where he had left her on the metal bench, perfectly calm amidst the apocalyptic vibrations shaking the very foundation of the dreadnought. She looked at the warlord, noting his frantic breathing and the terrified urgency in the posture of his elite guards. She offered him a tight, knowing smile. The human trap had worked flawlessly. Zarkon did not waste time with threats or royal grandstanding. He grabbed her by the arm, hauling her to her feet with enough force to bruise, but careful not to break her. She was far too valuable broken. He dragged the human scientist out of the cell, shoving her into the center of the armored formation. Elena did not scream or fight back. She matched his rapid, desperate pace, her sharp mind rapidly assessing the tactical geometry of the collapsing vessel. The apex predator was running for his life, and he was dragging his prey along to protect him. They reached the secondary hangar bay just as a massive internal explosion ripped through the decks directly above them, collapsing the primary access corridors in a cascade of molten slag. Only a single, heavily armored, long-range stealth transport remained on the launch pad. The Royal Guards aggressively secured the perimeter, gunning down a squad of desperate technicians trying to commandeer the vessel. Zarkon threw Elena into the co-pilot seat of the transport and slammed his massive frame into the pilot's chair, his four hands frantically dancing across the ignition sequences. The transport shot out of the hangar bay like a dark dart, instantly engaging its active camouflage arrays to blend into the violent, expanding debris fields surrounding the flagship. Zarkon aggressively piloted the small vessel through the chaotic web of plasma fire, dodging the massive burning hulks of shattered dreadnoughts. He watched out the viewport as his magnificent flagship, the absolute symbol of his authority, was finally cracked in half by a concentrated barrage from Vorak's capital ship. His empire was ash, his fleet was a graveyard, and his title was entirely meaningless. Once they cleared the immediate combat zone and slipped into the cold, silent safety of the deep void, Zarkon finally engaged the autopilot. He sat back in the heavy chair, the adrenaline slowly bleeding out of his massive system, leaving only a profound, hollow exhaustion. He turned his heavy head to look at Elena. The human woman was casually checking the navigational readouts on her console, entirely unbothered by the fact that she was sitting next to the most dangerous creature in the sector. But Zarkon knew the terrifying truth. He was no longer dangerous. The human species had casually rewritten the rules of the universe, and this fragile, bruised scientist sitting beside him was his only currency left. She was his absolute solitary bargaining chip to present to the terrifying civilization that had just erased his world without firing a single shot. The only questions that remained were whether the humans would even bother to negotiate with a ghost, and what kind of monstrous terms they would demand from a king who had nothing left to give. The void does not negotiate with the vanquished, but occasionally it sends a remarkably quiet messenger to collect the remains. Warlord Zarkon's stolen stealth transport drifted through the outer edge of the Cygnus Taurian system, its dark matter reserves completely depleted. The vessel was running on emergency auxiliary power, casting a weak, amber glow over the cramped cockpit. For 3 standard rotational cycles, they had fled the fratricidal slaughter of the Vaelian armada, slipping past the sensor nets of General Vorak's hunting parties. Zarkon sat rigidly in the pilot's chair, his massive hands resting uselessly on the dead control yoke. Beside him, Doctor Elena Rostova monitored the fading life support readouts with the detached focus of an academic analyzing a failed experiment. The proximity alarm did not shriek a warning. It simply chimed once, a polite, synthesized chime that felt entirely out of place in a dying warship. Zarkon lunged forward, his glowing yellow eyes scanning the viewport. There was no flash of slipspace rupture, no aggressive thermal blooming of weapons batteries charging in the dark. A massive shadow simply detached itself from the cosmic background radiation, eclipsing the distant starlight. It was a single human dreadnought. The vessel was a brutalist masterpiece of gray, angular armor and recessed engineering bays, utterly devoid of the artistic flourishes or terrifying spikes the Vaelians favored. It did not look like an instrument of conquest. It looked like a mobile factory designed for the mass production of death. The human ship did not hail them. It did not demand their surrender. A localized, invisible tractor beam seized the Vaelian transport with the irresistible force of a planetary tide. Zarkon roared, his pride flaring one final time, and slammed his fists into the manual override toggles, desperately trying to ignite the maneuvering thrusters. The controls were completely unresponsive. The human technology had seamlessly bypassed their kinetic firewalls and completely overridden the ship's internal network. They were pulled smoothly toward a gaping, illuminated hangar bay on the dreadnought's ventral hull. The massive atmospheric shielding doors cycled shut behind them, sealing them inside the belly of the beast. The transport touched down on the polished deck with a heavy, metallic thud. Zarkon drew his heavy plasma sidearm, the weapon glowing with lethal compressed energy. He grabbed Elena by the shoulder, hauling her to her feet. He would not be executed in a cage. He would step out onto the deck, and if he fell, he would take the human prize with him. He kicked the emergency release lever, and the transport's boarding ramp hissed open, lowering them into the bright, sterile light of the human ship. The Warlord expected to face a phalanx of heavily armored shock troopers, kinetic barricades, and a wall of directed energy weapons. Instead, the vast, cavernous hangar was remarkably empty. The walls were lined with rows of automated utilitarian loading drones, and the air smelled of ozone and industrial cleanser. Standing entirely alone in the exact center of the landing pad was Ambassador Elias Thorne. He wore the identical charcoal gray suit he had worn in the Grand Hall of Hubris. He held no weapons. He wore no protective gear. He stood with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, looking up at the towering armored alien and his hostage with an expression of mild, quiet expectation. Zarkon marched down the ramp, keeping Elena positioned firmly in front of his chest, the barrel of his plasma pistol pressed against her temple. His 4 royal guards flanked him, their energy pikes humming, their eyes darting wildly around the empty hangar, searching for the invisible trap. "Step back, human," Zarkon barked, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. "I have your engineer. You will provide a fully fueled warp shuttle and a safe navigational corridor to the outer rim, or I will scatter her atomic structure across this deck." Elias did not flinch. He did not look at the glowing weapon. He looked directly past the Warlord, his gaze settling entirely on Elena. For the first time since her capture 6 months ago, the rigid, calculating mask on Elena's face slipped. A profound, overwhelming wave of relief washed over her features. She looked at the man standing in the center of the hangar, the man who had walked into a den of monsters to deliver a warning he knew they would ignore, solely to orchestrate the most devastating rescue mission in galactic history. The unspoken bond between them, forged in the quiet, desperate hours on the frontier colonies, radiated in the space between them. Elias had not shattered the most powerful empire in the universe out of political ambition or military strategy. He had done it because they took her. "Are you injured, Elena?" Elias asked, his voice calm, cutting effortlessly through the tension. "Bruised, Elias," she replied, her voice remarkably steady, but mathematically sound. Elias nodded once. Then, he finally shifted his attention to the towering alien warlord. "The weapon is unnecessary, Zarkon. If we wanted you dead, you would currently be breathing vacuum alongside the rest of your flagship's crew. You are here because we require a definitive conclusion to this conflict." Zarkon snarled, pressing the pistol harder against Elena's head. "You have no conflict left. You destroyed my world. My armada is starving in the dark, tearing itself apart for scraps of protein. What more do you want from me?" "I want you to put the gun down and get on your knees," Elias stated. The sheer audacity of the command froze Zarkon. The absolute master of 1,000 conquered worlds, the apex predator of the Orion arm, was being told to kneel by a creature that barely reached his chest. A deep, violent roar began to build in Zarkon's throat, a final, suicidal surge of defiance. He never got the chance to pull the trigger. From the high, shadowed scaffolding of the hangar ceiling, 4 pinpoint beams of intense, concentrated red light painted the foreheads of Zarkon's royal guards. Before the aliens could even register the targeting lasers, a series of muffled, high-velocity kinetic impacts echoed through the bay. The 4 heavily armored guards collapsed instantly, their central nervous systems completely paralyzed by non-lethal specialized neuro rounds fired from automated defense turrets hidden in the architecture. Zarkon stood alone. The red targeting laser shifted, painting a glowing dot directly between his glowing yellow eyes. The warlord looked at his fallen, twitching guards, then at the calm, unarmed human standing before him. The crushing, undeniable weight of his absolute defeat finally broke the structural integrity of his pride. His homeworld was ash. His invincible fleet was a chaotic graveyard. His grand court was a memory. The terrifying reality washed over him. The humans had never considered him a rival. They had treated him as a dangerous mathematical variable that needed to be isolated and neutralized. How the United Earth Directorate would handle the billions of starving Vaelian soldiers tearing each other apart across the frontier was an impending logistical nightmare. But in this room, the war was already over. Zarkon's massive hand trembled. The glowing blue light of the plasma pistol flickered. Slowly, agonizingly, his fingers uncurled. The heavy weapon dropped to the metal deck with a loud, ringing clatter. The alien warlord, the ruler of the Vaelian Empire, collapsed to his knees, his massive head bowing in absolute submission before the frail human ambassador. Elena stepped away from the defeated giant, walking briskly toward Elias. He reached out, catching her arm, a silent, powerful gesture of reunion that anchored them both amidst the wreckage of a galactic superpower. Elias took a slow step toward the kneeling warlord, his polished leather shoes clicking softly on the steel deck. He looked down at the massive, armored creature. "You fundamentally misunderstood us from the very beginning, Zarkon," Elias began, his voice dropping into a chilling, analytical cadence. "You looked at our soft skin, Our lack of natural weapons, our preference for trade and agriculture, and you saw prey. You thought our desire for peace was a biological weakness. Zarkon kept his head bowed, the fight completely drained from his massive frame. We prefer peace because we understand the absolute, unmitigated horror of war. Elias continued, pacing slowly around the broken king. Your species evolved by overpowering the creature next to you. You fought with claws, then with swords, then with plasma. You view war as a glorious contest of strength, a sporting event with a high casualty rate. Humanity does not view war as a contest. Elias stopped, standing directly in front of the Warlord. For thousands of years, we were the weakest things on our own planet. We survived plagues, ice ages, and our own profound capacity for self-destruction. When we fight, we do not fight for glory. We fight for survival. And when survival is on the line, we do not hold back. We do not observe rules of engagement with a species that threatens our extinction. The human ambassador leaned in slightly, his voice a razor-thin whisper that sent a cold shudder down Zarkon's spinal ridge. Yet you brought 3,000 warships to our border to demand our subjugation. We brought a single mathematical equation to your homeworld and erased your history. We are a quiet species. Zarkon, but I highly recommend you never mistake our silence for harmlessness again. Death is a terrifying prospect for a king, but for a conqueror who has lost his empire, survival is a far more exquisite torture. Warlord Zarkon remained kneeling on the cold steel deck of the human dreadnought, his massive chitin-plated head bowed. He squeezed his glowing yellow eyes shut, bracing his neck for the kinetic strike or the burning slice of a plasma blade. He was a creature born of a brutal evolutionary crucible. And in his universe, the victor always consumed the vanquished. He waited for Ambassador Elias Thorne to claim his bloody trophy. He waited for the physical pain that would finally release him from the crushing psychological agony of his absolute failure. The pain never came. Instead, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Elias's leather shoes echoed across the hangar bay as the human turned his back on the defeated giant. "Get up, Zarkon," Elias commanded, his voice devoid of any triumph or malice. It was the tone of an administrator filing away a completed report. Zarkon slowly opened his eyes, profound confusion temporarily overriding his humiliation. He pushed himself up onto his heavy feet, his armored joints aching from the adrenaline crash. "Why do you delay the execution? Humans strike the blow. Mount my skull in your grand hall so your offspring can know you killed the master of the stars." Elias turned back to face him, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine charcoal suit. "Doctor." Elena Rostova stood quietly at his side, her expression an unreadable mask of cold calculation. "We do not have a grand hall," Elias stated plainly. "We do not take trophies, and we do not find glory in slaughter. As we speak, Directorate pacification fleets are dropping out of slipspace across the frontier. They are currently engaging your starving, mutinous armada. We are not destroying your ships with plasma fire. We are deploying massive, localized electromagnetic pulses to fry their propulsion and weapon systems, followed by targeted gravitational anchors to hold them in place. We are boarding your vessels, disarming your feral crews, and distributing emergency synthetic protein rations." Zarkon stared at the human, his predatory mind violently rejecting the information. "You are feeding my army." "We are managing a logistical crisis," Elena interjected, her voice sharp and clinical. "Millions of armed, starving hostiles in our border sectors is a statistical nightmare. We are neutralizing the threat by removing the desperation." Zarkon felt a sickening, hollow sensation in his chest. To be killed by a superior predator was an honorable end. to be treated as a starving nuisance, a feral animal that needed to be tranquilized and fed by the very species he had intended to exterminate, was a degradation so profound it defied Vaelian comprehension. "If you will not kill me, then cast me into the void," Zarkon growled, his pride flaring like a dying ember. "I will not rot in a human cage to be paraded before your people. You are fundamentally lacking in imagination, Zarkon." Elias sighed, shaking his head slightly. "A cage is a waste of resources. A prison implies that you are still a threat that needs to be contained. You are no longer a threat. You are a relic of a dead philosophy. We have a far more productive sentence prepared for you and the remnants of your loyalists." Elias activated a small holographic projector on his wrist. A faint blue image of a barren gray celestial body materialized in the space between them. It was not a lush, vibrant world. It was a jagged, scarred rock orbiting a dying brown dwarf star. "This is designated Outpost Tartarus," Elias explained. "It sits on the absolute fringe of human-controlled space. It possesses no heavy metals, no strategic value, and no native ecosystem. The atmosphere is thin, the soil is heavily alkaline, and the temperature barely rises above freezing. It is a harsh, unforgiving world." Elias deactivated the projection, his eyes locking onto Zarkon's. "We are relocating you and every Vaelian survivor we capture to the surface of Tartarus. We are stripping you of your kinetic armor, your plasma weapons, and your dark matter engines. Your dreadnoughts will be smelted down in our orbital foundries to build new atmospheric processors for the colonies you forced us to evacuate. You will not be given communication arrays or slipspace technology." The absolute horror of the humans' plan finally washed over the alien warlord. "You are abandoning us on a dead rock." "We are giving you a plow," Elias corrected him, his voice hardening into a decree of absolute finality. "We will provide you with basic agricultural synthesizers, hand tools, and genetically modified seeds capable of taking root in the alkaline dirt. You will learn to till the soil. You will learn to pray for rain. You will learn the profound back-breaking labor required to create life, instead of simply taking it from others. You wanted to know what it felt like to be prey. Zarkon. You will now be prey to the elements." Zarkon lunged forward a half-step, a primal roar tearing from his throat, but the automated defense turrets in the ceiling immediately whined to life, tracking his movement. He froze, a captive beast staring through invisible bars at his new masters. He was not being punished with death. He was being punished with irrelevance. The apex predator of the galaxy was being sentenced to become a farmer. How long does it take to break the spirit of a conqueror when the battlefield is replaced by a barren field of dirt? Decades passed in the cold, quiet dark of the outer rim. The wind on Tartarus howled relentlessly, a bitter, biting force that whipped gray dust across the vast rocky plains. In the center of a sprawling settlement built from scavenged stones and hardened mud, an old, heavily scarred alien knelt in the dirt. Zarkon's once glorious iridescent black armor was gone, replaced by thick, coarse garments woven from synthetic hemp. The heavy, chitinous plates of his body were dull, chipped, and scored not by plasma fire or the blades of rival generals, but by the endless, grueling friction of manual labor. His massive hands, hands that had once gripped the Leviathan throne and ordered the burning of 1,000 worlds, were deeply calloused and stained permanently with the pale, alkaline soil of his exile. He plunged a heavy, crude iron spade into the hardened earth, throwing his immense weight onto the tool to break the frost-locked crust. He was clearing an irrigation trench for a meager crop of engineered root vegetables. Every muscle in his ancient body ached with a dull, omnipresent throb. There were no medical bays here. There were no rejuvenation chambers. There was only the dirt, the wind, and the relentless biological necessity to eat. A sharp, metallic hum echoed from the bruised twilight sky above. Zarkon paused his labor, leaning heavily on the handle of his spade. He tilted his massive head upward, his faded yellow eyes tracking a brilliant streak of light cutting across the heavens. It was a massive human commercial freighter, a colossal vessel of gleaming steel and glowing blue fusion engines, casually navigating the slip-space lanes high above the colony. It was a stark, undeniable reminder of the gods who ruled the universe, the quiet architects who had inherited the stars while the predators dug in the mud. Warlord? Zarkon looked down. Standing at the edge of the newly dug trench was a young Vaelian. The boy was barely out of his molting phase, his chitin fresh and unscarred. He had been born in the dirt of Tartarus. He knew nothing of Vael Prime, nothing of the Grand Hall of Hubris, and nothing of the armada that once blotted out the suns. But the predatory instinct still burned in his genetics. The boy glared up at the passing human freighter, his mandibles clicking rapidly in aggression. They mock us with their ships, Warlord. They fly over our heads while we freeze. The elders whisper stories of a time when we were the masters. They say you commanded a fleet that could crack planets. Why do we not build weapons from the mining tools? Why do we not take the sky back? Zarkon stared at the boy. He saw the same blinding, intoxicating pride that had once fueled his own catastrophic reign. He saw the same arrogance that had led an entire civilization to laugh at a quiet warning. Slowly, the old king reached out with a trembling, calloused hand and gripped the young Vaelian's shoulder. His grip was no longer a threat of violence. It was the desperate, heavy weight of a profound moral lesson paid for with the ashes of an empire. "Listen to me closely, child," Zarkon rasped, his voice a dry, gravelly echo of the booming roar that used to shake throne rooms. Pride is the great deceiver of the universe. It tells you that strength is measured by how loudly you can roar and how much pain you can inflict. But the universe does not care about your fangs. Zarkon looked back up at the fading light of the human ship. True power does not need to boast. True power speaks in whispers. It trades in patience, and it calculates the exact cost of survival. We were loud, and we were arrogant, and because of that, we are standing in the mud. He squeezed the boy's shoulder, forcing the young alien to meet his tired, faded eyes. Never bare your fangs at the quiet ones, because when the quiet ones finally decide to go to war, they do not leave anything behind to bury. Zarkon released the boy and turned his back to the sky. He gripped his heavy iron spade, raised it high, and drove it back into the unforgiving dirt. The apex predator had finally learned his place in the food chain. Thank you so much for watching. Spacefarers, if you enjoyed this journey into the dark heart of galactic hubris, do me a huge favor and hit that hype button so the algorithm knows to send this video to more sci-fi fans just like you. Make sure you subscribe and share this story with anyone who appreciates a massive twist on the alien invasion trope. I want to hear from you down in the comments, so drop the word Ash right now so I know you made it all the way to the end of the exile. Until next time, keep looking up at the stars, but always remember to watch your step.